looking at the big issues of the 21st century. Sometimes we do granular stuff, sometimes we do really big picture stuff. And this afternoon we're discussing Brexit and what might happen, why it might happen, what it means for the UK, for Europe, and for the rest of the world. We've got a really excellent panel today. On my immediate left, Jonn Elledge, editor of City Metric, the New Statesman Cities website, also a journalist of the New Statesman, someone I've known for a very long time, and one of the PS21 governing board. We've got Chris Jackson, Pollster at Ipsos, Sir Michael Lee, former senior European Union official, now a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and Robbie, who is a senior fellow at Atlantic Council, looking at NATO issues in particular. We're going to do probably the first half of this on the record and on Skype, and then we'll probably take it off just to let some people throw in their thoughts if they so wish. I mean, firstly, Jonn, you just flew in from the UK. What's your feeling as to how things are going? The numbers kind of suggest it could go either way, possibly depending on what you believe, right?
Well, today's slightly terrifying development, I don't know if anyone's seen this, they finally announced which of the two Leave campaigns is the official one and therefore gets government funding. The reason this is terrifying is because the person who is funding the other Leave campaign is mounting a legal challenge to that and threatening to delay the whole process until October. If the referendum doesn't happen until October, then you might as well give up and go home, so the rest of the British politics is screwed for the rest of the year. I think that's pretty unlikely. My sense, this is all anecdote, I'm sure Chris will provide actual hard data in a bit. My sense is that everyone was kind of assuming it was going to remain. I was talking to the guy who writes the leader columnist, The Sun, quite recently. He was telling me that this was about a month and a half ago, they were all so convinced it was going to be a vote for Remain, they were trying to work out how to sort of, what to write about it in the run-up, because obviously Murdoch wants Britain to come out of Europe, all the Sunday editorial staff want Britain to come out of Europe, but at the same time they would like to back the winning horse. So they're trying to work out how to not come out for Leave without looking like they're not coming out for Leave. So I think the sense with a lot of people has been, you know, it's going to be a status quo vote. However, it's also clearly going to be about turnout, because the Scottish referendum, obviously the older people were likely to vote. In the Scottish referendum, older people were more likely to go for the status quo. In the European referendum, it's the other way round. So it's probably going to be quite close, and if the turnout among the over 55s is significantly higher than turnout among the younger generation, then obviously that could mean a sort of Leave vote by default, even if that's not really.
Do we think that people have met? Do we think that some people are changing their mind, or do we think that that it really is just about who actually turns up on the day?
I think a lot of it is the turnout thing. However, the reason I'm pro-European, the reason I personally started panicking is because of the number of people with whom I've had conversations in the last couple of weeks who I would just naturally have assumed would be in voters, who it turns out aren't. So I think I'm not sure people are necessarily changing their minds. I think the quality of debate we're having at the moment renders that pretty unlikely. I think it's more that there is just not a huge amount of love for Brussels. I think one of the reasons we're having this referendum in the first place is because it's been a very long time, possibly since the last European referendum in 1975, that anyone has actually gone out and enthusiastically made the case for Britain in Europe. We're kind of in there because we're in there and everyone thinks it's the least worst option. But this means that there's been no one out there banging the drum and saying, no, this is good for Britain's power, this is good for Britain's economy, this is where we need to be. That's not something that's been happening in public conversation for a very long time. So I think there are a lot of people who just haven't really been exposed to those arguments. Maybe we've been open to it once, but probably coming down on the other side because all they hear about is, you know, we are sending all this money to Brussels.
Chris, what's your feeling? What do we actually empirically know?
So I think some of the data really supports what we're just talking about, but the trend has been over the last couple of months for the race to narrow. It started off with a pretty pronounced Remain lead. People were really 60-40 or so on the Remain side, but in the last couple of months, particularly since Cameron came back with the deal that he negotiated with the EU, it's tightened to almost be 50-50 right now. And that's looking at polls essentially of the entire British population. And depending on the methodology, which is an interesting little area.
Different methodology gives you different results.
Exactly. Right? Telephone approach is a more traditional survey approach, gives you a greater remaining lead. Online polling gives you more of a tied vote or even a small lead. And right now, the opinion is actually divided on why that is. You have people saying it's because telephone polls are actually reaching people more effectively. They're getting better representative. And then on the other side, you have people saying that people are more likely to admit politically incorrect position, like leave, online when they're not actually talking to a real person. The reality is probably somewhere between a little bit. But the polls have closed over the last couple of months to the point now, it's essentially a coin flip in the polls. And I think what we're talking about turnout is actually really important for this, because you look at turnout over the last couple of British elections, general election turnout levels somewhere in the 60s, generally speaking. But the last time there was an EU parliamentary election, turnout was somewhere in the 30s. It was really low. But then the Scottish referendum turnout was in the high 80s. So huge variation in the range.
And the people, modern turnout? Do we have any data that points to what turnout would be?
We do that in the States. We're working on developing it in the EU or in the UK, but we do have a lot of data from past elections that we're using to look at. We don't really necessarily have that yet. But what I can tell you is, in existing polling, there are questions about if the general election were held today, how likely would you be to vote? And the same language for the referendum. If the referendum were held today, how likely would you be to vote? And excitement for the referendum is actually higher than it is for the general election. But the turnout's important because the people who are the most mobilized right now are on the leave side. The leave side has a lot of passion.
So everyone who really wants to leave will vote. People who vaguely want to stay may not.
Exactly. And I think you in the UK are actually captured in sort of the same cycle that we're seeing here in the States of this populist reaction to globalism. So I mean, essentially it's Trump voters. It's the British equivalent of Trump voters voting for leave. And they're not necessarily sure why. The Leave campaign hasn't really figured out a single message that people have gotten behind. But yeah, it's just we're angry, we're unhappy with the situation, and we want to register that. And anger is an easy emotion for people.
Michael, firstly, what do you think the feeling is in kind of informed European and Washington circles at the moment as to which way things will go, and secondly, how important it is?
Yeah, could I also develop a little bit of the previous comment, because I agree with that. And I wanted to say that I think for our American friends, in a way, what we're seeing is sort of Trumpism with British characteristics. And the British characteristics go back to a long, long history of Euroscepticism for different reasons, as we know, in the United Kingdom. But I think the origins of the present emotion on this, it's similar. It's the fact that both Britain and the United States are doing fairly well economically, good growth rates, very low unemployment, but median incomes have been stuck for a very long time. Some people calculate 15 years, some in the US would say even 30 years. And there's a lot of frustration with that, a lot of underpaid, precarious jobs. Then the immigration theme is very strong, both in the US and in the UK for different reasons. But in the UK, with some 3 million or so migrant workers from other EU member states, more than was expected. In my view, making a positive contribution to the economy, and all efforts to demonstrate welfare tourism and so on have failed. But nonetheless, the perception is there that the way of life is in some way threatened. As you say, I quite agree with you, a reaction against globalization in a broad sense, and the desire quite simply to say no or to sock it to the political elites of the moment. I think that is present there too. And an absence of strong leadership. I mean, Cameron has chosen the path not to resist. I mean, if he's so convinced now, it's not really on the basis of the package he negotiated. We didn't hear from him this kind of impassioned pleas for Europe until now. And therefore, the whole argument has been made by the sort of transactional approach, cost-benefit to EU integration. It's only very late in the day that he's presenting a kind of more emotional case for why Europe is important. I hope it's not too late. So I would agree with this broad analysis. In the EU, I think opinions are divided, but on the whole, governments and elites would like to see the UK remain. I mean, in France, I think the person in the street, if asked, the majority of public opinion would say good riddance. We've had enough. We've had enough of all of this. Britain is a bad European. Britain has a transactional approach. Britain has never believed in the project. Stock enlargement was largely the Brits were to blame for that. The EU has never been the same since. And good riddance, with some simplification. But the elites don't take that view, I think. And certainly political elites don't take that view. They want the UK to stay. In the case of France, the French elites don't want to be left alone with Germany, so to speak, in the EU. And in Germany, I think they don't want to be left alone with France as a more protectionist country. So I think among these sort of big three, at least, the elite feeling is that Britain should stay. And I think that contributed to Merkel really helping out with the deal, for what it's worth, that Cameron brought home. In Central and Eastern Europe, and even in some sectors of opinion in Western Europe, it's a little bit more nuanced. In Poland and in the Czech Republic, there is the risk that if there's a leave vote, there would be a similar head of steam developed in those domestic politics, counterbalanced by the fact that they're receiving something like 4% of their GDP in transfer payments from Brussels. So that may give a pause for reflection. Even in France, an opinion poll showed that 57% of the French said that they would also like a vote on whether to remain or leave, and the Parliament has picked that up. So there's a mixed picture in the EU. As far as the United States is concerned, I think it's very striking and positive that Obama changed his program for his visit to Europe. He was going to go to New York for the COP's agreement signature and then to Hanover. In fact, he cancelled his New York visit so he could go to the UK. And I'm sure he'll be making the case very strongly that a strong Britain and a strong Europe is what the US government favors. Now, what impact that has on public opinion, I don't know. I would say on the whole, positive. I think Obama is still more popular in Europe and in the UK than necessarily in the US. So I think that's a positive thing, but one always has to be careful with megaphone diplomacy.
I want to throw that to Jonn and say, but I'm only going to Robbie first. I mean, there is an element, I mean, this is Brexit, and Washington said this is simply seen as a threat, a bad thing that may happen, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think he was absolutely correct. There's the United States has always, or at least in this administration, seen as Britain, a strong Britain and a strong Europe will, help underpin a strong U.S. global presence in the world. And so in that sense, the Brexit is harmful politically. I think it's fair to say there's also a prevailing sentiment in the United States that defense, that security, that Europe's global outlook is more dictated by the finance ministries than the ministries of foreign affairs or defense. And I think that's definitely an issue at play in the U.S. perspectives, that there's been a whole host of studies that have come out on the harmful economic impacts of a Brexit, and many are wondering what that would do to Britain's global outlook, to Britain's defense posture. Britain has been struggling in recent years to keep up with its defense posture, with its NATO commitments. NATO asks kindly that all of its 28 members spend 2% of its GDP on defense. Currently, 5 of 28 members do. And when the UK was looking to re-up its defense spending, there was actually a question of whether it would meet the 2%. It's one of the few countries that does, and it did this time. But there's this prevailing sentiment in the United States that Europe's just really not playing its part, and you've seen that.
Trump is tapping.
Yeah, you've seen that with Trump. I mean, I follow NATO issues, and NATO has until I would say 2014 been seen sort of as an arcane Washington establishment issue to follow, where okay, it's fun, but is it really important? And now it's really caught in the limelight, especially in the campaign trail, which is surprising. And unfortunately, well, in my opinion, unfortunately, the only light that has been cast on NATO is from Donald Trump saying, do we really even need to be in NATO? What do the Europeans do? Why are we bankrolling their defense? And so there's
and a Brexit would reinforce that view.
Yeah. I think there's just a view that Europe is unraveling. and keeping Europe together is really important to American interests. And if Britain is, 15% of the EU's economy, almost 15% of its population, and 10% of the EU budget, what would a Brexit do to an already fragile EU that's seen political cracks and fissures across its members? And in addition, could there be, second impact domino effects, such as, there have already been murmurs of a Czechsit. The recent Dutch referendum on Ukraine has shown how EU solidarity is not as strong in an issue where it was once seen as very strong. So it's definitely a worrying picture.
With the Scottish referendum 2 years ago, I was kind of struck by the thought that while everyone said it would be awful if Scotland went the same way, in the rest of the world, if not in the UK, it would have got a lot of goodwill. I mean, a US State Department would probably have been positively inclined towards an independent Scotland to help it out. I get the impression that there's going to be a lot of irritation with the great British people should we vote the wrong way. I mean, what would the actual cost be in terms of sort of goodwill, or leaving aside the numbers from the financial consequences?
I think the cost. I think because the issue has taken there's been such partisanship on the issue. You hear either it's going to be disaster or it's going to be the best thing. I think the bottom line is, if there is a Brexit, it's not going to be a new utopia, and it's not going to be a calamitous apocalyptic disaster. It's going to be somewhere in the middle. And the political impacts, the security impacts are going to be diffuse. They're going to be hard to measure, but that doesn't mean they're not going to be there. I think Britain is no offense here, but I think Britain is seen as a middling power, but one of the last remaining European partners that has a global outlook. And a Brexit will really chink the armor of Britain standing in the US as one of its partners that has the global outlook.
But how important is the Obama speech? Because there's the lazy sort of UKIP thing has always been we can finally stop dealing with the Europeans and go back off and play with the Americans. And America seems to be trying as hard as it can, as politely as possible, to suggest this isn't the case. Is that kind of filtered through, or?
It's getting important. Everyone's. It comes back to this point about the global elite. I think it's like there is almost nobody in the top flight of a global power, whether in business or in politics, who thinks that Brexit is a good idea. Like corporate leaders and powers from the US to Japan to China.
So then there was almost no one at the top right, the global elite who thought think the euro was a great idea.
I'm not saying they're right, but I'm saying I'm just not convinced that Obama coming out and saying, no, this is a travel thing, is going to swing that many votes, because these are not, the people who are really passionate about this are kind of, it's beyond the sort of matter of reason. It's a faith-based position. On slightly entirely different point about European defence spending, I think it's worth recalling there was a point when European powers enthusiastically spent huge amounts of money on defence, and it didn't tend to end well for Europe or the rest of the world. But that's by the by.
Yeah, no, I mean, I take your point on that. I mean, I wonder to what extent both sides have sort of slightly overplayed it by either utopianizing or catastrophizing what they're talking about. I mean, the odds are that a Brexit could well be less catastrophic than the stay campaign one. By the same token, leaving obviously isn't going to be as utopian as the other. I mean, the country could probably muddle through either way, right?
I mean, I think that's probably true. The main reason that I count myself as a pro-European is I do not see what problem Brexit is meant to solve. I do not see how it increases Britain's political power. I do not see how it increases our chance of economic well-being. We're probably, to be in the trade bloc, we're probably still going to have to accept a lot of the rules and sort of open movement, free movement of people and so on. I just don't see what the positive outcomes are meant to be other than assuaging various angry old people.
And you see that in the data coming through, the opinion data coming through, that any of the rational reasons for staying or leaving, people somewhat ambivalently agree with, but it's very muted. It's not like people have strong belief that leaving the EU is going to bring about a new economy, or leaving the EU is going to destroy the economy. People may agree with the statements, they don't care. The things that they agree with, the things that seem to be mobilizing people in the data, are these much more emotional issues, particularly on the leave side. So, for instance, immigration. isn't a majority issue, but for those people who believe in it, they believe in it really strongly, and it's really mobilizing.
And is immigration the main? I mean, Trump is about immigration.
Immigration. Well, Trump vaulted to prominence because of immigration, but that's actually not been the mobilizing factor for his supporters. The mobilizing factor has been this sort of new populism, and that's sort of the same thing we're seeing with Brexit. Is that those rich, affluent people in charge have been running things for a while, and I've gotten a bad deal, and I want to change things. I don't care if the thing I want to change actually makes sense or not. I just want to change things. That's the Brexit.
Let's assume that the people who want to stay inexplicably fail to vote because they can't really be bothered, and we find ourselves in the end of June with a Brexit that's with the Democratic mandate for Brexit that nobody really wanted. What would the next stages be, Mike?
I think the consequences will be that the already very, very difficult European agenda, with one crisis or disorder piled on top of another, will become that much more unmanageable for the next 2 years, because this issue will then dominate EU discussions and British discussions for at least 2 years. I mean, what will happen is that under the Article 50 of the treaty, discussions will begin, negotiations will begin between the UK and the other member states concerning the conditions for British withdrawal. And there are 2 years to complete these negotiations. If they are not completed within 2 years, then either all of the parties agree to a prolongation, or the UK's secession from the EU takes effect, and the UK is then treated like any third country. In trade terms, it benefits from most favored nation treatment under the WTO. So it gets charged the kind of customs tariffs that any country is charged if it doesn't have a preferential agreement with the EU. I mean, the substance of these negotiations is obviously going to be Britain's future relations, and the model that is there, or the various models that are there that people toy with, Canada, Switzerland, Norway, are all unsatisfactory for different reasons that have been discussed. But if the UK wishes to maintain its access to a market which constitutes now 45% or so of its exports, there is no choice. It's going to have to negotiate such an agreement.
But I mean, these negotiations will have to fit in the same type of negotiations that is trying to solve the refugee crisis, that are trying to hold the Eurozone together. I mean, this is going to be the weekend summits where lots of leaders come together and do stuff, right? And there's a limit. So what I'm trying to get at is where this is going to sit on the great chain of priorities. Because the migrant crisis is still high up, the Eurozone crisis hasn't gone away.
I think
it was kind of challenge that was already kind of number 3.
Yes, it will challenge them, because what the EU can do on all the other items is going to depend to some degree on this. And if it can be an agreed divorce under conditions that will lead to a smooth transition, then the EU will be able to address these other issues, or to whatever extent it's capable of addressing these other issues. But if there's a real fight, and if there's a split which is not agreed, the UK leaves in a huff, so to speak, then I think the EU's capacity to deal with all of these other challenges will be very much reduced, and the EU leaders will know that. And so it won't be just a little quiet negotiation on the side, in my view. It might almost come to dominate the agenda.
And what are the real sticking points going to be there?
The UK wishes to maintain its access to the single market. The conditions that Norway, for example, was obliged to accept for that are free movement of workers, which is one of the main reasons why the UK wishes to leave, because of the problem of free movement of workers. A financial contribution, which in the case of Norway is something like 85 or 90% of the UK contribution per capita, having left. So the financial conditions will have to be negotiated. And then what happens to services, which is a predominant concern for the UK, financial services and so on. Other issues will pop up during the course of those negotiations. Some will try to seek to introduce again the rule that euro transactions would have to be conducted in the future within the Eurozone, and that this would be a major challenge to London. There are any number of complex issues that would have to be resolved, and there's no clear vision of what the relationship would be at the end of the day. The Norway model, the Norwegians themselves have, the Norway-Europe minister advised the Brits not to go for the Norway model, because it means accepting all the EU decisions about regulatory matters without being able to control them. The Swiss model, a series of bilateral agreements, not satisfactory. The Canada model doesn't really include services. So there is no model that we can just build on and take it over as the basis for our future relations. So these are going to be very tricky negotiations.
You just enlarge on the services issue. What exactly would be talking about there in terms of the decisions?
At the moment, there's a kind of passport in the EU, whereby a bank, for example, or an insurance company, or a brokerage that is authorized to conduct business in one member state automatically gets a passport and can conduct that business throughout the 28 member states. So if you're not a member state, that doesn't apply. You must then have a branch of one of your companies that is fully established within the EU in order to benefit from this passport. So financial institutions, financial services providers in the UK, banking, insurance, brokerage,
so this would probably be the sort of small and medium ones, right? Someone like Barclays would already have a presence in the European probably.
Yes, although even then, I think its status would need to be negotiated. But you're right, certainly smaller companies would find this most difficult to deal with.
I mean, how involved would the US get in this process? We saw with the Eurozone crisis, multiple meetings where either the Treasury Secretary or someone like one of his deputies flew in and shouted at everybody to get to the next stage. I mean, is that the sort of thing you'd expect the US to take if we go through this process?
So that's a difficult question, because if apparently it might be in October now, but if, knock on wood, it's June 23rd, it's going to be essentially with a lame duck administration. So the Obama administration has really tried to take
this could still be going on 2 years into President Trump or Clinton.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, I mean, that's true. Well, so, I mean, speaking on just the Obama administration, I think that you'll see the upper echelons of our political leadership have a say, maybe some backdoor dealings and the speech, and Obama's trip to Britain. But beyond that, I don't think you'll see much. I think the mantra of the past 8 years has really been Europe is, a vibrant, capable collection of like-minded democracies. They can, handle crises on their own. Us stepping in, the 800-pound gorilla might actually, trip negotiations up. You've seen that with Ukraine, to a lesser extent with Libya, where we, in a sense, tried to lead from behind as it became infamously known, but you definitely wouldn't see as heavy as a diplomatic or political footprint as you might see with other administrations.
I mean, Jonn, what does British politics look like the week after Brexit? Is that the end for Cameron? Is that
Cameron has consistently said that his future is not tied to the results of this referendum, and everyone else has consistently said, "Yeah, you're kidding yourself." There.
Yeah, British public opinion says that if he loses the referendum, he
should call an election or resign.
Resign.
They're two different options, right? And someone else could take over the party and run it for 4 years.
He would have to resign. His party do not agree with him on this issue very much. Most of the Tory grassroots would much rather their leader was campaigning out.
Of course, there's not a good leader for the Tories right now, except for the mayor of London, who's divisive himself.
This is a side note, but the weird thing about Boris Johnson is very unclear what he wants other than to be Prime Minister. He has no ambition.
He wants to be, he's kind of Donald Trump.
Yeah, he's very, everyone's Donald Trump.
So the first question, I suppose, is that if there's a Brexit, particularly because people didn't bother to turn out, will there be an immediate regret for what we've just done?
Yeah, potentially.
I think there is a sort of flowering of national pride. And we can. will make the best of a bad job?
I think it'll be recriminations, because Jeff Cameron is the best asset the Conservative Party has electorally. He's managed to win the last election, which nobody expected the Conservatives to get a majority, and he did that. And there is very few politicians in the top rank who are that popular. Boris on some measures, but I think people don't take him seriously as a statesman. I think people like him as a
Personal
figure.
favorability aside, that's kind of.
I mean, who do the British people want, according to you?
They don't want anybody. There is not a single figure in British politics right now that has a dominant position.
Sounds familiar.
I mean, is there I mean, let's again play that forward. So we'll be therefore expect kind of the Trumpisms, the arrival of, step forward, Sir Alan Sugar, presenter of the British Apprentice, as a new strong man for a new age. I mean, how much unpredictability are we talking about?
Potentially, I mean, the one thing we've seen is Cameron's favorability ratings have been declining as this issue's been playing out, and it's also been impacted by the economy. It's impacted by the new budget that they just released, the Panama Papers. We haven't even actually seen the results of the Panama Papers on this in the opinion data yet. We're very eager to see that.
When will we see that?
Should be seeing it this week, probably.
What would you expect?
It's not going to be good. Because, Cameron right now, his favorability is really the Tory party, right? Nobody else outside of Tories particularly cares for him. And with the Tories, it's sort of the middle classes, right? The sort of the B, C1, C2 are sort of the bulwark of his thing. But those are the people that are also very much on the Leave side of the referendum. So if he gets discredited as seeing like one of those people, which he's done a good job of not being seen as that, he's sort of been able to have this, I'm a rich guy who came from a very well-off family, but I sort of feel your pain a little bit. If the Panama Papers actually have hit him on that and have actually damaged him, he's going to lose the credibility he still has to convince those sort of middle classes of the Tories to stay on the Remain side. And then you're going to see the Tories go from about 45, 55 Remain Leave to like 30, 70.
Which is ironic because the UK Let's Leave page is basically will become a really big tax haven. Does the US even care who runs Britain after Brexit, or is it would they just be cast off into the outer darkness to do our thing?
I mean, going back to what I said, I don't think it'll be apocalyptic, and I don't think it'll be a
Would Prime Minister Johnson be able to get in to see the president?
Yes.
Or would he be confronted with the vice president?
Yes, I absolutely. I mean, it's definitely in the U.S. interest to keep a Britain in an EU and to keep a strong EU together, but it's not going to be catastrophic. The UK will be less special in the American's eyes, but it won't completely throw out the special relationship that we've been cultivating since the end of World War II. I think.
No, it's. If there was an election after Brexit, if the British people got their desire and a temporary prime minister called an election, what would happen?
That's a great question. I mean, right now, polls show Labour and Conservatives sort of splitting the vote, but that's right now. That's not in the wake of a Brexit referendum. That maybe the Conservative Party, who knows how you can see if that's winning or losing, considering that they're divided themselves, right? But like you're saying, Cameron is the only figure in the Tories right now that has that stature, that national stature. And if he personally loses, it's probably not good for them. The problem is, it's not like Jeremy Corbyn is seen as that much stronger of a figure, or any of the other major party leaders. There's a bit of a void right now that a strong, popular figure could actually step in to occupy. It's just hard to see how that happens with the mechanism of British parliamentary politics.
But opposite scenarios, assuming Brexit doesn't happen, everyone breathes a great sigh of relief. Firstly, Michael, what happens then in the rest of Europe? There's a lot of other crises going on, and there's also a lot of other potential referendums that could be read.
Yes, but if this referendum comes out in favour of Remain, then I think the pressure for similar referenda in the Czech Republic, in France, for example, will diminish, because it will be seen to have failed, and that the populace will then have to go on to other issues. Because if in the UK, of all places, with a party like UKIP, with the Tory party divided, the majority of sentiment in the country, and the Tory party probably in favour of leaving, if that doesn't happen, then the prospects of it happening elsewhere are less. So, I mean, looking at it positively, I would like to think that after a decision to leave, to remain, the British government would feel freer to engage more on Europe's other issues. I think one of the striking features of the last year and a half, at least, if not before then, is British absence on the other crises facing Europe. And I think it's particularly marked when it comes to foreign policy issues, because the Brits are really behind the whole idea that there could be a sort of coordinated European foreign policy. When Britain joined the EU, famously, the phrase was Britain had lost an empire and not yet discovered a role, and it was looking for that role through the EU. However, for the last couple of years at least, whether it comes to the Minsk process or efforts on Syria, the UK has been rather absent. Also on the refugee question and on the euro. I mean, for the euro, Britain is quite clear that it will not participate in any bailouts. That will remain. The refugee issue too. Britain is not a member of the Schengen zone. The open border arrangement within the EU is not participating either in the idea, at least, of sharing out some of the asylum seekers. Not that the others are doing so much better. So the hope would be that where it seemed as though British interests called for it, Britain would be more ready to engage than it has been recently. And if there was just this little bit of good news coming out of the UK, it could conceivably start to change the mood a little bit in the other member states. And the doom and gloom and the collapse of Europe being imminent and all the rest of it might diminish, and people might start looking more constructively at some of the other.
And is that your feeling, Pick? Like people here, Europe is screwed, says everybody always, what do we do? Then they have a disagreement over what they do about it. And also, how does this factor into the thing that, I mean, if from Washington's perspective, with these sort of military-industrial Washington, Europe is a Russia story. I mean, that's the dominant factor. How does that play into that?
I mean, I think absolutely right that the UK has rescinded itself a bit from foreign policy. Cameron was conspicuously absent from Merkel and Hollande overseeing the Minsk agreements, which was big. I think it's definitely seen in the United States, especially here in DC, through the Russia prism. And I think
Brexit is a victory for Vladimir Putin.
Yes, and I think that's just a bit of muscle memory that the challenges to Europe's southern periphery are so much more diffuse and hard to define and hard to develop solutions for, that it's easy to go for the big traditional threat and focus a bit on that.
Sorry, if I can interrupt.
Yeah.
I think it's also true that Putin is kind of in favour of Brexit.
Yeah.
The one common factor with a lot of the slightly more outlandish politicians back in Brexit, like Nigel Farage on the right, or I don't know if everyone's aware of George Galloway, who's a left-wing.
And a lot of them.
They're both quite pro-Russia. They both pop up in Russia today.
And the same is true for a lot of the other forces in Europe that are anti-migrant or anti the mainstream.
There's definitely some fishy funding streams that are allegedly coming from Russia that are going into fringe political parties in Czech Republic. I'm not as familiar with the UK, but definitely more Hungary and Greece.
France as well.
Okay,
And we saw some of this with the Dutch referendum. Right?
Yeah. So there's definitely that. I mean, the one thing I will say to sort of add a silver lining to this cloud is it's so easy to get caught up in the headlines and the doom and gloom, but look at where Europe was 70 years ago. Even we have a generation that has a memory of World War II, and modern Europe is such a unique project. And it's it's not doom and gloom. It's not completely falling apart at the seams. The Brexit will not be the start of a new catastrophe in Europe. Modern Europe is in a lot better state than you would hear from many on the campaign trail.
Well, I mean, it's kind of a matter of subject degree, right? I mean, if you ask people 10 years ago, modern Europe was so dull that even your worst case scenarios were not particularly interesting. and now that is probably not the case. I mean, well, you've been doing the Europe thing for a long time, right? I mean, it's not the 1930s, but it's also, if one discounts the risk of nuclear war with Russia, which obviously was there until the 80s, it's people are about as bleak on it as they've been most of that.
I was just doing a feeble attempt at optimism here, so.
No, I mean, I think it's very good to remind everybody that levels of violence in Europe have declined, that there's no question of war among the member states. General prosperity levels have increased despite the recession.
We're still the best place in the world to live for most people in it. Right?
Yeah, and the fact that you've had such high unemployment all these years with little or no violence. You have highly developed social security systems. I think all this is very striking. However, the multiple crises that Europe faces, which I count as 6 major crises, will be exacerbated by Brexit. There is absolutely no doubt. And that's why Putin welcomes this, because clearly he doesn't want to see a more effective policy by Europe, a more united policy on Ukraine. Britain certainly is one of those who, if somewhat feebly at times, puts its weight behind a tougher line, vis-a-vis sanctions and Russia and so on. Similarly, on Syria and other issues, a Europe without Britain, in which Germany, which is still something of a large Switzerland when it comes to security and defense, would be much less likely to take a strong line. And the other issues too, I think, would also be far more difficult to resolve, plus the fact that the agenda will be dominated, by the Brexit negotiations for the next 2 years. So I think there's, no doubt that the consequences would be, in a way, just as serious, if not more serious, for the EU as for the UK.
I mean, would Brexit make the collapse of the euro more likely, do you think, as a result?
Britain has always been strongly in support of the euro while not being a member of it, and has been in favor of all the various actions that the Troika has taken to try and stabilize the situation, unsuccessful that they've been in many cases. The fact of the matter is that there will be a new crisis over Greece sometime soon. I mean, in July, Greece has to reimburse 3.5 billion euros of debt. Probably there will be a flexible attitude taken by the Troika at the urgings of Germany because of the need for Greek cooperation on migration and other issues. But Greece is simply being bought off, and there's been no debt forgiveness, nor has Greece committed itself to really thorough reform. So this is just waiting to happen. And then Portugal is in a shaky position, some banks in Italy and Spain, and so on. So I think the euro crisis is in remission rather than having been cured.
And the migration-related crisis, particularly political crisis in Germany, is barely in remission at all, right? That's probably on the beginning of a rise.
Absolutely, yes.
Does anyone have any questions of this, Judge?
I have one question. I was interested in the prospect that if Cameron loses the referendum, he is then, if he's not unseated, potentially the person who's then responsible for negotiating the exit. And I guess there's a question over whether he would do that in good faith and what sort of deal one could possibly hope for when you're the loser of the referendum, yet you are also responsible for negotiation. I just wonder if the panel
has a situation in which the Greek government is intimately familiar with.
Well, I think this is one reason why he probably won't be Prime Minister for very long after Brexit.
I mean, it will be his fault, right? He is the guy who did the referendum, and he probably didn't have to, right?
I think Cameron's biggest strength and biggest weakness as a politician is that he's very good at tactics. He's very good at doing things that will solve today's problem and kicking the can down the road. And his position he's always treated Europe as a matter of internal Conservative Party management. And to an extent, that's what this referendum is about. He's trying to settle the European question, not to keep Britain in Europe, but because he wants it off the agenda for future Tory leaders. So he sort of staked so much on this, I really don't think he could possibly retain that job.
Is that what the numbers broadly suggest?
Yeah, it does. His personal popularity has been saved to us now to a large extent. If he loses on it, it's essentially the same as losing a confidence vote.
If he wins, is he therefore a stronger, greater man, possibly on the course for a third term if he wished?
I think potentially, yeah. If Maine wins, particularly if Maine wins by anything approaching a large margin, then he'll be the guy who saved the Europe project to some extent. I think that his standing with the Conservative Party is going to still struggle a little bit. His decision, I think this is a great characterization, it was a tactical decision to hold the referendum, but it's actually hurting him long term because it's creating fissures in the Conservative Party that are going to take time to heal.
I mean, Michael, how if Cameron did survive, how limited would his clout be at a summit? Would he be in a better position than a Boris Johnson or someone no one's ever heard of?
Well, better than ever, you know. I mean, certainly the existing European leaders have, in the end, bent over backwards to help him out. I mean, perhaps it was not with great joy that they did this, but the package, which has been much maligned as insignificant, nonetheless, from their perspective,
was designed to look significant.
Yes, and I mean, an opt-out from the principle of ever closer union and the so-called emergency brake on migration, and the fact that the Eurozone will not be able to alone take decisions affecting the City of London and so on. In the EU, these are seen as fairly major concessions, and the Belgians, for example, are not at all happy with them. So these are the people that handed this deal to Cameron. So I suppose they would prefer to deal with him than somebody breathing fire.
How would Boris Johnson go down at a European summit?
I think Boris Johnson can be all things to all people. Boris Johnson went to the European school in Brussels. Boris Johnson's father was a colleague of mine in the European Commission. I mean, he only narrowly decided in the end to back the Leave campaign. He might have come out on the other side if his calculations were different. And if all this were to come to pass, and he were to be the Prime Minister, and he was confronted with this very long to-do list of negotiations, and he knew that his possibility for winning the next election would depend on a creditable job, I think he would have to do his best, notwithstanding his inclinations and his personal style.
How does Cameron? I mean, Obama has been throwing Cameron under a bus quite a lot recently. I mean, he blames him almost single-handedly for Libya, although in that article in the Atlantic in a way that is almost flattering to the UK. The fact that America thinks that Britain could have solved Libya had we only pulled our finger out, I find very flattering, but if not necessarily convincing. I mean, Cameron has always been an irritant to Washington right up to that point.
I mean, I wouldn't characterize him as an irritant. I would characterize him as a leader of a country in the midst of an age of many irritants. And he's very much defined in the United States by all of these crises that are roiling the EU. I think he took a major hit in 2012 after the Syria bill in Parliament.
In terms of his clout.
Yeah, in terms of his clout, in terms of his respectability, and in terms of the United States and the UK always seeing eye to eye and walking in step in foreign policy and military operations. I think regardless of whether or not he would remain after a Brexit went through, he would essentially be a lame duck in the eyes of the United States if he had staked his credibility on Brexit. I think I'm not sure many people in Europe appreciate the political shockwaves of the parliamentary 2012 vote and what that did for our confidence.
I just want to because I always get the impression the opposite is true in the UK. I mean, in the UK it was not Cameron's finest hour. It was the moment where he didn't become Blair. He kind of listened to British people and if anything, probably benefited slightly from doing that. Right?
I think that's overstating it. I think that it's certainly true there was no appetite whatsoever for another war in a Muslim country. And I think there's still a lot of dislike of Tony Blair and his legacy. However, it did sort of make him look weak. I mean, that was one of the few times he managed to get voted down by the opposition. The last government, considering it was a coalition, was actually pretty stable and successful getting its agenda through. That was one of those times where it really was boggling. And also, it is a sort of critical moment in this narrative of Britain withdrawing from the world, which it's kind of done over the last 6 years. And so, the ceasing to be a country trying to punch above its weight and becoming just another medium-sized European nation.
I mean, to an extent, though, this is similar to what's happening in the US, right? We did punch above our weight, it didn't work out terribly well. And both Britain and the United States are trying to kind of work out what you do next.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm glad you brought up the Goldberg article, because it actually surprised a lot of people in the United States, that Goldberg article, because it seemed like something that would be written in memoirs decades later from a president.
Rather than one that has almost a year to go.
Yeah, rather than one that has almost a year to go, shifting blame from Libya, which many in the Washington establishment were very surprised and not happy with, calling 2 of our closest allies in Europe free riders. And I think it just,
the 2 that actually do put in most of the effort.
Yeah, the two that put in most of the effort. And I just think it plays back into this sentiment that Europe isn't doing enough, and how can we rely on Europe, and why should we rely on Europe? Why should we jump through all these bureaucratic and diplomatic hoops when we can go it alone? And I don't agree with that sentiment, but I think there's many people asking that. And while Donald Trump has said a lot of crazy and very controversial things, regardless of the issue, what he said about NATO and what he's saying about Europe, while I disagree with, many people do agree with, that span the political spectrum.
I mean, sort of isolationism is a bit of a majority position in the States nowadays. I mean, one, if you ask Americans to locate the EU on a map, much less the UK on a map, they'll probably struggle. So when asked essentially to,
which is a shift from 50 years ago, right?
A little bit, because 50 years ago, a lot of Americans have been to Europe for one purpose or another. But nowadays, the country is extremely inward-looking right now, primarily focused on the economy. And when we do look outside of ourselves, it's almost exclusively through the lens of terrorism. And terrorism is not about building things. Terrorism is about blowing stuff up, basically, the way Americans see it. So Obama's article, the Goldberg article, or Trump's campaign position, that's actually reflecting where the American
and Brexit would reinforce that the rest of the world can't be trusted to sort itself out.
I think the broad American public will not terribly much care what happens with Brexit. Brexit's more of
it just adds to the laundry list of things they don't care about but don't like very much that takes place overseas.
I think they will. It will be if the Brexit falls through and they remain in the EU, it will be a minor blip in the headlines that Americans pay attention to.
Just like Scotland not becoming.
Yeah, and I think if a Brexit goes through, it will be a larger deal, but still not a totally significant deal that rocks you. I do want to highlight one thing you mentioned that I thought was really important, and that's just the generational divide here. I mean, for decades, Europe and North America had been, forging stronger ties amidst really, a wide group of individuals with experiences from Europe, from World War II to the Cold War, where Americans were really invested in European security and vice versa, and fought and died alongside Europeans. And that generation is slowly fading, and the new generation, the younger generation, doesn't have those direct impacts. So the sinews of transatlanticism are really weakening here. And I think what Obama and Trump are saying is really a reflection of that.
I think one of the things that's sort of driving all of that is sort of going back to something you said at the outset, is there hasn't really been a cheerleader for the benefits, the perks of the globally integrated society. It's all drawbacks. It's all jobs being outsourced and wars we're getting into.
Because the person who did that in 75, slightly against type, was Margaret Thatcher.
Right. Or in the 80s, it was Ronald Reagan, actually, who was talking about making the world safe for democracy.
Margaret Thatcher signed the Single European Act, which is one that created the Single European Market. And then within 2 years was given a brief speech about the terrible idea of the European project was. What happened in those 2 years is a mystery.
Chris, we can knock the transcript on the this one I'll throw